The official funding plan for the third bridge includes $1.50 tolls on the Marion and Center Street bridges and the new bridge, a new 6 cents a gallon local gas tax, a new $25 a year vehicle registration surcharge, and a 37-cent per $1,000 of assessed valuation property tax increase in Salem. This local funding is needed because ODOT is on record as saying that the state and federal funds will only cover 10% of the $430 million cost. Are you in favor of these new tolls and taxes? Why hasn't the Salem City Council held a public hearing on funding the plan for the third bridge?
Because there is no funding plan. I just reject the premise of that. That is part of a draft discussion. We can't have a really accurate discussion of this with a funding plan until we complete the environmental impact statement. That is part of that project. Why people want to stop that discussion is beyond me. This thing needs to be completed. We need to understand the scope of the project. We need to understand the design of the project. And then we'll talk about how to pay for it. And if that is the funding model, that's going nowhere. That is going nowhere. But we don't have, as a city council, anything in place to hold that public hearing yet. When we get that EIS and we get that whole package pulled together and we start talking about the scope of a project, then we have something to talk about. And why folks are uncomfortable, and I know the guys who come up with these numbers, who's gonna vote for that? Are you gonna vote for that? I'm not gonna vote for that. That's not a good idea. And the suggestion that a state highway bypass of Salem is gonna be paid for by Salem, I think that's just not true. That ain't gonna happen. 10% is not gonna be paid for by feds and state, and the rest of it by local residents. That's not how this would be funded. Nobody is gonna accept that idea. And so I think fundamentally, those numbers are flawed. And we can hold a public hearing. You know what everybody's gonna do? They're gonna come in and say, I'm not going for that. You know what the council's gonna say? I'm not going for that. Thank you for your thoughts. But we gotta get down to reality here and get off of, I'm gonna give you the most god-awful scenario I can think of or can make up or have read in various sources, because I have no doubt that's based on something. But
I can tell you what it's based on, having been on the task force.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen so many different funding models.
It's a model.
Yeah.
That where you can move the indicators around, you know. Well, if you drop the property tax so far,
this goes up
it's accurate in that it says if you need X million dollars,
exactly.
This will generate X million dollars. Exactly. I mean, the algorithm is correct.
Yeah.
But
to say this is the model that we could hold a public hearing on, I think is just faulty.
That's crazy, yeah.
But we could, and I think I know we will, we all will, us, Kaiser, Marion, Polk,
right.
The legislature and the feds are gonna have to at some point sit down and seriously say, okay, here's the EIS. Here's what the need looks like according to the EIS. Here is the scope of the project needed in this generation on this bridge, because these bridges grow over generations. You don't build a 4-lane bridge the first year. That's just not the way the real world works. It's just the way our own bridges work that we currently have. So we need to kind of stop and everybody cool down just a touch and get this thing done so we can have at some future date a serious discussion and a public vote, because none of this is going to happen without a public vote. It just won't happen.
In every one of those jurisdictions?
In every jurisdiction, and it's going to have to pass in every jurisdiction to happen, because if you don't, you've got to revise the funding model because you can't raise the money. So I understand the sentiment. I understand it completely. That's where I came from. I am not convinced that a Selwood style bridge at this time isn't a good idea. You know, hence the Salem alternative concept, that concept. I just, but to say we're gonna walk in and build a half billion to $1 billion bridge with local revenue?
It'll end up in that range no matter what.
Yeah, ultimately, at some future date, that whole project, if it were built out completely, as I think some people imagine it, or the EIS could even imagine it, may come to that, but that's not the way it would ever be built. It would never be constructed in that way, because we don't need all of that today. And we're not gonna build stuff we don't need, I don't think.
Oh.
This bridge, I view it as the second bridge, I'll be honest with you. I think this two bridge system is a
As one.
single bridge. You got lanes going this way and lanes going this way. It's a one bridge system that we have yet to have, I think, a really full analysis of its optimal use, coupled with a better understanding of how to move traffic through downtown. And there's just a whole bunch of issues that just are unresolved without that EIS being in place. So, yeah, no, I'm with
Of
you.
course,
I don't want to do any of that, okay?
Isn't the EIS, though, follow-up question here, isn't the EIS of a particular option?
Yes, it is. It is the EIS of a particular option that allows us, essentially gives us permission, if we can fund it, to build it, something.
Yeah, exactly. And
Like something
even
short
though the
of-
feds are not gonna fund it, they can scotch it.
Oh, they can kill it,
Totally.
and I mean, we've still got a
Right.
lot of stuff. There's so many moving parts in this thing right
Right,
now,
right.
that
The weird
this
part,
is not the moving part yet, though. The money
No.
isn't the moving part.
the weird part of the whole process, and you know, been on 6 years, 7 years,
Oh my God, yeah.
is that you move it. There are two weird things. You move an option, you know, like you're playing with a different structure of it. You move it to increase its meeting the objectives for local,
Yeah, yeah,
and you increase the probability the feds will say no on environmental grounds.
that's correct.
The other option that was very interesting in the process is you move it up and down the river one way or another, and the east side and the west side disagree.
Yep.
There was almost never an option that you did that improved the vectors for both sides of the river. So it was always a competing thing, and you know, and the key thing is if you move it away from the existing bridge's location, it drops off in its ability to handle the rush hour problem.
Yeah.
And there's a good argument that the rush hour problem is the only problem we've got.
Well, I think there is a
Anyway.
good argument. The rush hour problem is one problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's
It's not the worst problem.
no.
That's
No,
right.
it's got, I think the worst problem, the more important problem is the funneling of all I-5 traffic moving through here,
Absolutely.
through downtown, is a terrible plan. And
Right.
only Salem, in its long-term history of interesting planning, could do this. They would find an east-west way to cram it onto two streets and a north-south way to cram it onto two streets, and put its housing development on a north-south axis and its commercial development on an east-west axis. And then what you got's the perfect storm of commercial and
The journey to work
residential.
model doesn't work.
Yeah, it just brings it all into the middle, and it does not improve this city and this downtown
Yeah.
to have that mess happening. And we describe it in multiple ways, you know, rivers of traffic. We
Exactly.
describe all kinds of potential solutions, none of which
I never
meet the
heard that.
problem. This one, I think, is trying to deal with the east-west commercial axis more than, but we've now compounded it because we're creating over on the west side, particularly the northwest side. If all of that housing is built out, a really substantial residential problem too. I mean,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
just getting worse and worse and worse, and I don't know. The question is, does this bridge solve that problem? And I think there's such total polarization. You go over up in the hills in West Salem, and it's like, my God, get that damn thing built now,
So
immediately.
I commute to Portland.
Anything, yeah, so I can get out of here. It's an interesting problem, and I think that's why we got to keep talking. We will find a solution, and we can't get ourselves hung up on how we're going to pay for it, because that's not the issue yet.
This,
Well-
I don't want to dominate this
Sorry.
generically on this issue, but what we have, and I'm going to give you my big thinking
Okay.
idea. What we have is an inability to accurately assess the big picture.
Yeah,
I mean, my big picture idea is you build a simple span across the Willamette, down near Dundee somewhere.
yeah,
And you connect it with the I-5 and that makes the journey to the coast for trucks or vacationers or anything from Portland, it takes a good half hour off it,
yeah.
at least, even compared to going through Sherwood and Newburgh
Right,
and all that.
right.
Okay, then you do a streetcar in Salem
Oh, it'd be
that
fantastic.
spans the bridge. And
Love
we
it.
become the small city example for the nation that Portland is for the nation as a large city.
Large city. I would love that, and
And
if
it would
we
be
had-
a third the cost or less, and federally fundable.
if we could get everybody to just stop for a minute, take a deep breath, get
Yeah.
through the bridge concept, and look at what that bridge is there for. What are we trying to use that for? I just think we've not had a full discussion on this yet, because we're wrapped around the axle on this particular configuration. And I don't think we're done. I think we're still talking. Yeah, I think we're still talking.
Well, I've had several people tell me that the environmental impact study has to be done first, and then other people tell me that the financial element has to be figured out first.
It can't be.
It can't be
well,
without the EIS.
Well,
The
it seems
process
that
will not let it.
Yeah,
it seems that both of them kind of have to
They kinda
be
come-
evolved a little bit.
They come
and to
together.
get closer. That you
Yeah.
can't do one and ignore the other, and
No,
that's
you-
kind of I think where this question came from.
I think
or
it
are
does
you
too. And
not addressing these what you kind of categorized as a deal killer, these cost elements that you wouldn't be for them, and you don't think that they would pass. So if there isn't a seeable future to pay for it, why are we spending the time
no,
and the money?
because we don't have part of the EIS is this. It sets
Right.
the scope of the project.
Right.
This is based on a project. It may not be the project. And what the EIS does is give us kind of just if you really boil it down, it gives you a location and a maximum scope to talk about. That's all bottom line, I think that's all it gives you. Then you refine it over time based on cost, based on need, but what we don't have is a location and scope. And location and scope come together, because of your environmental impact. But I think until you've got that, you really got nothing to talk about. And this is a refinement of that discussion, but you can't do it till you get to those fundamentals.
Yeah, I really hate people that blame everything on the feds.
Yeah.
Because it makes but the feds make a little chicken egg problem.
They do.
That's difficult there because their regulations say we need to see a viable financial plan kind of coming
Yeah.
from you before we approve anything and before they will approve giving it any funds. They need to see
Yeah.
the entire financial plan. So you're in a semi-bind,
Well,
you gotta kind of do both at the same time.
You do. I mean, but you still have to have, I think, a location.
Yeah.
Then you talk scope and design, which sets cost, and then you talk about how to pay for it. And when you can talk about how to pay for it, you begin to interact with the feds on their ability and the state's ability. All we have to do is kind of sit back and watch the gyrations over the Columbia River crossing
Oh my God.
with a location in place.
And there was never any doubt where.
No
it's
doubt
gonna
where
go.
it'd be, nothing like that. We're not even to the point of knowing where it's gonna be. That's what this is about, ultimately.
There's an element that the Columbia one brought up that we haven't faced realistically here, and that is the appropriate technology as you look into the future.
Oh, yeah. There's so much to talk about here. This is such a rich conversation.
Well, let me ask one more question
But
on the bridge.
don't
and
cut
then-
it
I
off. Don't
interrupted
let it
you,
cut
I'm
it off.
sorry.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. We could talk probably for a long time on
we
the
can
bridge.
talk all day about this.
But from an environmentalist, what do you say to somebody that's interested in alternative forms of transportation, that sees the future as not personal auto based, therefore as less sees less need for an auto bridge in the future as the big project, and isn't necessarily opposed to looking and moving
Yeah.
forward on that, but wants an equal, and that's the key to my question, an equal expenditure of monies
Yep.
and time
Yep.
and discussion on the alternative, like trolley or bicycle or pedestrian or this type of thing. And what they see, council, is, focusing and spending monies on the auto bridge, but having a much smaller
Commitment.
focus on the future if auto isn't the dominant, if third bridge isn't the dominant future.
Well, I think they have defined Third Bridge in their own way. They've
Yep.
said it's all about auto.
Yep.
That's not what this, when we talked about it as the Salem alternative, we talked about bicycle, we talked about walking, we talked about connectivity to the between parks and neighborhoods, and a whole bunch of, I think, livability related issues. That's that's part of the conversation that develops as you design the bridge. You can design a bridge at that location doing what it's supposed to do with streetcars. You can design it with buses, you can design it with bicycles, you can design it. There's a whole batch of things you can do there. Once you agree, it goes here and its scope is X. And they're talking about a fairly, and this is where I get frustrated too. Don't misunderstand. I get real frustrated with this. Oh yeah, we're going to talk about 4 lanes and all this stuff, and here's how many cars it'll move. You know what? There may be, if everyone is right on the bicycle, walk, streetcar, etc. side,
alternative.
it's a different bridge. It's just designed differently.
course.
It's paid for differently. If we're still in car culture in 20 years, as a whole big part of this community believes, it is a different bridge. And we're gonna have to figure out how to accommodate both. But until you get through this EIS and agree it's here, it can cover this much space, it will have this environmental impact, which can be or can't be mitigated, no matter what it is, we got nothing to talk about.
Can't move ahead.
You just can't move, you're stalled. That's why there's no bridge at Mission Street today. You couldn't get down Mission Street without tearing out
Bush
part of the
Park.
park and all of Deepwood and all of that. They found that out, and you know what? It stopped there. This could have the same problems, and we don't know yet, because there's wetlands over there, there's an urban growth boundary decision that needs to be made, there's a batch of decisions that are still unresolved. We don't know yet. But I think people need to they have decided this is all about cars. It isn't all about cars. It's all about getting across the river and trying to create connectivity. I think there's more to it. I don't think anyone's lost their way yet on this thing.
Just for your background, Chuck, I remember making almost exactly the same argument you just made 5 years ago, and having others work on it too. The process of looking at it, the Third Bridge Task Force, it would get only so far, and then that's out of the oversight committee. People would come in and say, that's out of the scope of what you're allowed to talk about.
Yeah.
See, in other words, what about a bike lane, transit bridge?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's out of the scope of this. We'll handle that later.
That
You
comes
see,
later.
And the acceptance of the operating procedures that start. You know this yourself. You know, my God, how far upstream do you have to go to affect the process appropriately? See, I mean, the goals of what we were to meet, and you know, it's all nicely, very, very left brain.
Oh, yeah.
And I have great respect for CH2M Hill.
Oh, yeah.
I've consulted with them before on other projects, and then I kept a steady communication with our consultants. They did a good job, I think, of managing the process without dictating the outcomes at all.
Yeah.
What would happen though is the oversight committee people, the politicians, would come in and remind us that, well, we have to make the decision, you know, you don't make the
Yeah.
decision. And here are the criteria, you know, which we, through painful process, accepted at the start.
Well, and I think that.
So there were certain things that were precluded.
No, there were things that were precluded, but I think those are not off the table.
No,
I think
no.
this is an evolving story here. But what we'll be able to do is have the discussion. And you know, what I reject, I'll tell you just out of hand, because it's just not true, is stop now. 1 year from completion of this EIS, just stop now. We will just stop talking about it because the city is spending $60,000 a month. That's just false. That is just false. That is not happening. City's not spending $60,000 a month. Somebody might be at the federal or state level, but the city of Salem is. Yeah, I probably ODOT, probably the feds, I don't know. But I heard it yesterday, and I asked about it last night at the budget committee. Where is this coming from? Well, I guess as people see it happening at other parts of the process, but it is not happening with the city. We need to have this over with. This, for us to walk away after 6-10 years of work by local citizens, getting to this point, to me, would be just such a mistake, and the next generation would be saying, well, I remember when we talked about Pine and Hope, just like I remember when we talked about Mission. You know, it's like, can't we just get through this once and see? I still think we have a discussion coming. I'm sort of in the camp of there's still a bridge up at Dundee somewhere, or Lincoln,
Sure.
or someplace else
Sure.
that is missing from this discussion. But
You know, the fact is, we don't have a bridge between Salem and Newburgh.
that's it, and it creates
And
some.
the way even it fits into Newburgh is kind of downstream.
It's sort of, yeah, it's sort of pushed in. I know this is a big deal to people. I know in your editorial board there's strong feelings about this. I share those feelings. I mean, I'm not trying to walk away from this thing, but I think we've just got to get through this process. We have just got to get through this process and then engage in the next debate. We've got years of this to do together, and the disagreements will be profound and heated and all that, but let's get done with this part of it.
Just a clarification on my question about the involvement of alternative transportations equal
Right.
to the auto. I meant at the same time that we're talking about the bridge, but not necessarily those alternative transportations for the bridge,
Oh,
but
I'm sorry.
elsewhere in town.
Oh, God,
as
yeah.
an even, because
Yeah,
they look at it now as, yes, we're talking
I
about
see
that,
what
but
you're
down here.
Oh, I see what
And
you're
we're
saying.
still much
Yeah.
more focused on
Yeah.
the auto bridge. Ideas that, like, for instance, live work hub, like things so people don't have to live and go over, live on one side of the river and work on the other side and then go to school
Yeah.
back on the other side. And planning larger,
Well, I'll tell you, we're doing a big chunk of it here in Salem. We're looking out with our urban renewal areas, North Portland Road, as an employment and education and shopping hub for that entire area up there. Same thing in West Salem. West Salem really ran into some problems with the decline of the food processing industry. We are redeveloping
Yes.
that whole little industrial area, which, by the way, is next to its employment
That's right.
worker housing area into, we hope, a more modern retail, commercial, light industrial area. still located next to it that
Don't
allows.
finish your planning until we get you a trolley stop, a streetcar stop right in the middle of it.
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
I mean, you'd have a Pearl District
Oh,
spread just like
well,
that.
and even now, with some of the planning we're doing, we're going to be able to have serious pedestrian and bicycle access,
Yes.
along with, again, we have not left the automobile here. I mean, let's be honest, we have not said we're not gonna be using the automobile.
Of course not.
Because we also haven't done, I think something that council's talked about for years was, if nothing else, wheel trolleys. I continue to believe Broadway, up and down Broadway, all the way through High.
Out commercial, out
and-
center.
Yeah, that we have not done east, west, north, south. Part of it is we haven't had really good leadership, communication, commitment between the transit district and the city since Rose City, or whatever it was called, Cherry City
Cherry
Transit was broken off from the city. It just never, and I brought it up during the discussion. I think the mayor has a real role there. I think, I mean, I'm just blown away that every day 16,000 people come into that Capitol Mall area, and there's no public transit system that moves them
Right.
back and forth from downtown. I'm just blown away by it.
Exactly.